Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos a nuestro tercer y último webinar de esta serie que hemos organizado en relación con las alianzas financieras en camino hacia el cero neto en emisiones. Quiero agradecer en primer término a quienes han colaborado con nosotros como organizadores del Sustainable Academy de eco.business, UNEP, Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, PRI, FINRESP y por supuesto nuestro agradecimiento también a todos los colaboradores y media partners que han hecho esto posible. En los webinars anteriores hemos conversado acerca del Net Zero Banking Alliance, es decir, la alianza de los bancos, y en el segundo hablamos sobre el tema de los inversores, sus estrategias frente al cambio climático. En el día de hoy vamos a estar conversando acerca de las compañías de seguro y en ese entorno, digamos, cómo están enfrentando esta lucha contra el cambio climático y cómo están adhiriendo a las iniciativas que hay en ese sentido. Antes de comenzar con nuestras palabras y el programa que tenemos previsto para hoy, quisiera simplemente recordarles que ustedes como participantes han inhabilitado el acceso a los micrófonos y al chat, pero sí pueden comunicarse, interactuar con nosotros y realmente nos apreciaríamos mucho que así lo hagan a través del botón de preguntas y respuestas o Q&A según el tipo de configuración que tengan. Quiero además mencionar que este evento contará con interpretación simultánea a través de el logo de globo terráqueo pequeño que tienen en el borde inferior de sus pantallas. Estas interpretaciones simultáneas se harán en español, en inglés y en portugués. Y también quiero mencionarles que esta presentación, las presentaciones que utilizaremos, así como la grabación de este evento, también estará disponible en la página que luego les haré llegar el link de conexión. En primer término, quiero dar la palabra a Mirencho del Valle, ya secretaria general de UNESPA, y que hablará en representación de FINRESP, que es el Centro de Finanzas Sostenibles y Responsables de España, y quien nos dará un breve marco sobre el rol de las compañías de seguro respecto del tema del cambio climático. Adelante con el mensaje de Mirencho, por favor.
Buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias a UNEP por invitarme a participar en este webinario sobre la Net Zero Insurance Alliance en representación de FINRESP. Para quienes no nos conozcan, FINRESP es una red constituida por las 5 asociaciones empresariales que representamos los intereses del sector financiero en España. Representamos a las distintas tipologías de entidades de crédito, a los fondos de inversión, a los fondos de pensiones y a las entidades aseguradoras. Y nuestro objetivo es ayudar a que España pueda transitar mejor hacia una economía más descarbonizada, poniendo nuestro acento en la ayuda a la pequeña y mediana empresa, que es la base del tejido empresarial en nuestro país. El tema de la ponencia de estas palabras introductorias tiene que ver con el papel que puede jugar el sector asegurador en la sostenibilidad. Y muchos piensan que como somos una actividad poco contaminante, poco tenemos que hacer en la sostenibilidad. Y es justo lo contrario. La sostenibilidad forma parte del ADN de las entidades aseguradoras. Y podemos hacer mucho en 2 vertientes. Una bien conocida, que son las inversiones, y otra tal vez menos desarrollada y conocida, que es la de la suscripción, la del desarrollo de nuestra propia actividad aseguradora. Y voy a referirme primero a este tema, al más desconocido, al de la suscripción, porque el sector asegurador lo que hace es conocer y analizar los riesgos, y a partir de ahí intenta proponer soluciones para mitigar sus consecuencias. En este sentido, somos un proveedor de prevención y un aliado de primera magnitud para empresas y ciudadanos en el desarrollo de su gestión sostenible. Y luego, cuando los eventos se producen, que es algo que nunca podemos evitar, estamos allí para ayudar a la recuperación. En este sentido, son las entidades aseguradoras las que marcan sus políticas de suscripción, pero es verdad que esas políticas de suscripción pueden también ir virando poco a poco para ayudar a la sostenibilidad. Y en ese sentido es importante conocer el papel que juega el sector asegurador en la cobertura del riesgo climático. Y me quiero referir aquí a dos instituciones que son fundamentales en la colaboración público-privada: al Consorcio de Compensación de Seguros, que da cobertura para riesgos extraordinarios, donde están cubiertos los riesgos climáticos, pero también otros eventos como la erupción volcánica que se está produciendo en este momento en la isla de La Palma, y también Agroseguro, que genera un escudo de protección en el mundo agrícola y ganadero y que ayuda también a mantener esta importante actividad en lo que venimos a conocer como la España vaciada. En el ámbito de las inversiones, somos un inversor institucional de primer nivel. En este sentido, invertimos cada día de la semana, incluidos sábados y domingos, 22 millones en la economía, con lo cual somos un aliado necesario para esa transformación hacia una economía menos carbonizada y más justa. Pero para poder desarrollar nuestro papel necesitamos también certezas, necesitamos seguridad jurídica, necesitamos que el marco regulatorio nos acompañe. Y en ese sentido necesitamos una taxonomía completa. Europa está trabajando en este ámbito, está trabajando en definir un lenguaje común, de tal manera que todos llamemos de la misma manera a las mismas cosas. Y en este sentido es importante también que haya emisiones verdes. Existe un apetito inversor en sostenibilidad del sector asegurador, pero es necesario también que haya más emisiones y es necesario también que para realizar nuestra labor de información tengamos un repositorio de información a nivel europeo que nos permita acceder a los datos que vamos a tener que trasladar a nuestros clientes de manera homogénea y comparable. Creo que estamos en una senda donde la participación del sector asegurador y la participación del sector financiero es fundamental. Podemos ser la palanca que ayude a Europa y al mundo a realizar este cambio. Y en ese sentido, desde FINRESP, como Alianza del Sector Financiero en España, estamos totalmente comprometidos a desarrollar esta actividad en favor de la sostenibilidad y de un mundo más justo. Muchas gracias y les deseo todo lo mejor en este webinario.
Muchas gracias, Mirenchu. Realmente un mensaje que nos ha dado un panorama muy amplio y muy preciso, digamos, de cuál es la situación y la contribución del sector. Quiero dar ahora la bienvenida a Jerry Wilbanks. Jerry Wilbanks tiene su base en New York y está a cargo de Global Casualty and Environmental Line of Business de AXA XL. Tiene un trabajo muy protagónico también en el Net Zero Banking Insurance Alliance, y nos va a estar compartiendo con nosotros, va a estar conversando acerca de cómo las compañías de seguros pueden contribuir en ese camino al cero neto, sobre todo la interacción con un sector que es clave, que es fundamental, que son los reguladores, supervisores en este campo. Welcome, Sherry. Thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. And apologies, after spending so much time in Asia, my Spanish skills are poor, so we will proceed in English. So it's a pleasure to speak to everyone here today a bit about the topic of being on the financial industry and insurance regulation and regulators and their role in the net zero agenda. So if we can go to the next slide, I thought before we get into the specifics of the role of regulators, I wanted to set the stage of what challenges we face with the net zero agenda. The last few decades have shown that the nature of governments, differing leaders with differing agendas, changing priorities with the pandemic or civil unrest at home, has meant the actions of state governments has not been at the pace and scale needed. Additionally, given the large role the private sector, and especially private finance sector plays, these real economy actors need to step up with their own ambition and actions. And this action of the real economy, however, has led to some issues of greenwashing. And even for those very knowledgeable on sustainability topics, it can be difficult to really detect what is accurate and what is not. So this topic of greenwashing has come up quite a lot in the last few years. And lastly, the entire ecosystem that supports the net zero agenda must be improved. More ambitious, clear, actionable, and accountable if we have success. So I think everyone is aware that COP26 just ended in Glasgow. And if we take a bit of time for reflection on what has been the outcome of that and what has been the outcomes of the last 15 plus years, these are some of the challenges that have come forward. Moving on to the next slide, please. I always like to take time to do a quick introduction to the net zero initiatives and the topic of net zero. I don't ever like to assume that everyone is familiar with what net zero is. So we're going to do that very quickly. Next slide. So starting first with the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, was the first of its kind, with close to 190 parties signing. The target to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees C, was set. This was an important milestone, but why is this specific temperature requirement so important? Anything above this is considered by climate scientists to result in an unlivable world, and results above 1.5 C are still considered quite catastrophic. So by setting this very clear limit, these very clear target, this was very important as part of the work. The agreement also specified that emissions need to reach their peak soon, as in now, and the next 10 years. This is because of the long life of many of the greenhouse gas emissions and recognizing that developing countries will need more time to transition. And the second half of the century should be spent on getting a balance between greenhouse gas emissions and removals that is sustainable to allow Earth's atmosphere and temperature to be stable and sustainable long-term. And that is a very big challenge. So if we take those two distinct aspects, what is considered to be important now in the next 10 years, and that is really reducing those peak emissions, that is a big achievement as well. That is a big task. And in the second half of the century, to really get that balance between the emissions and removals, that's also a big task. So it's important that we sort of separate the two and we get to work on the greenhouse gas reductions now. Moving on to the next slide. So out of the Paris Agreement, there was this recognition that state actors alone were not going to be able to achieve what is necessary. So while the Paris Agreement is for state actors, the nations, the Race to Zero campaign was started to mobilize the efforts of actors in the economy and around to form this net zero ecosystem. Race to Zero brings together many facets of the real economy and has a net zero by 2050 target. Accredited members have high ambition, net zero goals with credible plans to achieve this. This work now covers nearly 25% of global CO2 emissions. And as you can see from the list on the right, there are a number of real economy actors covered, including the financial institutions. But go to the next slide, please. So the financial institutions, this was a recognized important player in the net zero economy. And Mark Carney convened the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero this year. So you can see all the different net zero alliances listed there. The net zero alliances are still credited under Race to Zero that I just discussed. So the high ambition and the credible actions are still there. Added as well is a commitment to reporting and transparent accounting. The methods used to count carbon emissions should be clear, and this carbon accounting is not an easy task. And Butch might talk a little bit more about this when he discusses the Net Zero Insurance Alliance later. So underneath this GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, we have several different financial industry net zero alliances, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the Banking Alliance, which I believe you learned more about already, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, and joining us recently this year, the Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance and the Net Zero Investment Consultants Initiative. Next slide, please. So I won't go into a lot of detail about the Net Zero Insurance Alliance because Butch Bacani will be doing so next. But I just wanted to share here that this was the insurance-related alliance that was convened this year in July. And you can see a list of the 8 founding members there, along with 6 of our most recent joiners to the alliance. Next slide, please. So I know that it can be a bit confusing to talk about having the Paris Agreement, to having Race to Zero, GFANZ. And so this picture is a nice graphic to sort of put all of that together, and you can see where everything fits. In the middle there is GFANZ, the specific financial services related net zero initiatives. You can see their connection to Race to Zero on the left next to them. And as part of that accreditation and being as part of the net zero alliances, you can see what needs to happen in order to be accredited, to be part of those. And you've got an expert peer review group off to the left of that. So the intention is for all of this to work together. It definitely is not meant to be confusing. The reason that Mark Carney thought it was important to have an organization like GFANZ was because of the synergy that can happen when these different financial institutions are working together. And indeed, there's a lot of overlap in between some of the activities and actions. Even if we take ourselves as insurers, while we have the risk management, risk transfer actions and businesses, many of us, all of us, also have investments. And so most of, or if not all of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance members, for example, are also members of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, because there is that collaboration and coordination that needs to happen because we have both types of activities. We go on to the next slide. So with that net zero background, I want to talk a little bit about the role of regulators and the part that they play in the net zero agenda. Next. So again, not wanting to assume that everyone has a background in the regulators and financial services, of which insurance is one, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And so I've centered on these items. At the heart of this is the regulator action is to ensure that consumers are protected, that there are no financial shocks, and economic progress happens in a steady and consistent manner. So that's what you get around those roles and activities covered: the market efficiency and integrity, making sure that consumers are protected, and which includes the competition and pricing, ensuring that there's no illicit activity, and keeping that financial stability. When considering what is regulated exactly, the scope usually covers the financial institution itself, the markets that the institution operates within. These might be things like the stock exchange market, or even the the insurance markets, and the products and services the institution provides, so those specific items. This covers everything from investments and lending to advisory and wealth management. So in our sector, it would also include the broking activities that happens with our colleagues in the major broking community. Next slide. So this is a very busy slide with a lot of information on here, and it could have been much busier, but I kept it somewhat concise with just a few. Regulators and supervisors in financial services do vary from country to country, and there are some international organizations that act in an advisory manner to these regulators. These advisory organizations typically consist of representatives from the country and regional regulators and supervisors. So you can see some of those listed there at the top. And those are just, a few examples out there, but probably the main ones. I've not covered the important regulators of South America here because I'm sure you are all well aware of who those institutions are. Instead, I've shown some of the more prominent institutions out of Europe and the United States. These are often, followed and highlighted because sometimes the actions from these groups have an impact in other parts of the world. We might see that other places in the world will follow suit with something that is done in one of these regions. So that's why they're often listed and considered. Other advisory associations who work to keep a stable financial services sector are shown at the bottom. These again have a wide membership, and many of them are international, and their role is to also provide advisory services and information to the regulators and supervisors. You may notice that this list is not all insurance related. Indeed, insurers play an important role, both as the provider of risk transfer and, as I mentioned, as an investor. In fact, many of the insurers here are playing a role in different parts of the financial services, and so involved with several of these. The last one on this list is the Insurance Development Forum, which is an interesting one for insurer sustainability efforts, bringing together these subjects. If our UN colleagues have not shared more with you about IDF yet, I'm sure they will be soon. Next slide, please. So what role do regulators then play in net zero? We know a bit about now what net zero is, what we need to accomplish, what the objectives are. And we know a bit about what regulators are here to do, the financial stability, looking out for the consumer. And so how do we put those two together? What does that role look like? I've got just a couple of sort of the current actions and some potential actions that are listed here. The first one relates to the drafting or requiring and promoting and auditing of standards. This is a recognition of the climate change impacts and the impact on financial stability for insurers. And that's your Solvency II type of rules in many jurisdictions. There is a concern about any sort of activities out there in the economy that might cause a shock to the financial system, especially after the events that happened with the subprime mortgage lending many years ago. And so there's a special attention now given to the impact of climate. And so there's a lot of efforts now to ensure that climate is a particular risk that is detailed in many ways, and that includes for us as insurers. So there's a recognition of the role of climate on the financial stability of insurers, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So that's one of them. And then there's the reporting and disclosure requirements making them specific and consistent. An example here being whether or not to include or not include in that the own greenhouse gas contributions of a company. This is usually centered around scopes 1 and 2. And just for clarity, scope 1 emissions relate to the emissions of your own operation. So those you'd make yourself. Scope 2 are your upstream supply chain related emissions. So the emissions related to getting goods or services to your operation. And so that's one important role that regulators can play in requiring. So they can draft the legislation, they can make the requirements, they can do the auditing, they can set the standards around this kind of disclosure. A second one that I've listed there is around peer collaborations on sustainability matters through associations and alliances. And this is important for those of us working in any of these net zero alliances because we are working alongside our colleagues at other companies. And so we need to be able to do that. This comes against some competition considerations. And if we look at the competition landscape out there, there's no consistency, just like there's no consistency in how insurance is regulated. And so we look for getting some clarity on that, whether or not there's formal or informal guidance that can be given. In some locations, it's only informal guidance. You will never get anything specific out of the competition authorities. And others, it's much more formal. And in consideration of the broader economic concerns associated with climate change and how these sustainability efforts play a role. So I'm giving a few examples there on the right related to the two different concepts on the left. The first one is in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission is currently going through a public disclosure process and seeking feedback relating to requiring disclosures and public filings related to climate. The idea behind it and what I've quoted there is to facilitating the disclosure of consistent, comparable, and reliable information on climate change. And some of you may be familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is one of the options most cited and most often used. Why this is important for us as insurers, and not only relates to disclosure requirements for our own operations, but it means that the companies we're insuring from a commercial property and casualty standpoint, they will also be disclosing. And so we will be able to get clear and credible and consistent information across our clients that we're insuring. On the second topic around sustainability efforts and competition, I note that the UK Competition and Markets Authority just recently did a request for consultation for competition considerations in relation to sustainability efforts. And they sought information from those out, not just in financial services, in every different industry, to provide feedback to them on what could be changed or what could be done differently within the competition authority to promote sustainability efforts, to make sure that peers could work alongside each other on these matters and do better. So we think both of these are good examples and in the right direction. Go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the impact of climate change on insurers, if I just kind of sum this up or it's kind of two questions there I've put it. So what's the impact of climate change on insurers versus how insurers can impact climate change? And I'm sort of setting the stage for Butch's discussion next. I mean, there's a recognition that there is an impact of climate change on insurers from a short-term profitability standpoint, which could lead to long-term insolvency potentially, whether this is weather-related impacts from droughts and floods, or even rising life and health claims due to the extreme weather events, pollution, food instability, and others. There's also some climate litigation happening in some markets with the accusations of climate liability or lack of climate action, which can also have an impact on insurer profitability and long-term solvency, because these were not necessarily accounted for in some insurance policies before. So there's definitely an impact of climate change on insurers. And we also talk about what insurers can do or the impact insurers have on climate change. We look at the role of insurers as potentially being an enabler to greenhouse gas emitters through the risk transfer options available to them. We understand as well that happens through the reinsurance markets, so there's in both places. But I also wanted to highlight the other role or the other impact that insurers can have on climate, and that's providing the sustainable claim solutions, supporting a green transition, and providing those client risk management services so that we can help our clients manage risk. So I like to give these two different views. It's not only the impact of climate on insurers, it's also what is the insurer impact can have on climate. So the initial insurance industry support for these considerations on what we can do on climate-related matters was provided by the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, the PSI, and is now supported by the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. So with that, I think we should hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for your great and valuable overview of how the insurance sector, can contribute in terms of this terrible fight against the impact of climate change. Great message. Thank you so much, Sherry. Now, ahora vamos a pasar a nuestro próximo invitado del día, que es Butch Bacani. Él es el líder del programa de ONU Ambiente en su iniciativa financiera y fundamentalmente liderando la iniciativa que tiene que ver con los principios de seguros responsables que acaba de mencionar también Sherry en su presentación. Él está a su vez también cumpliendo un rol protagónico en esto que tiene que ver con el Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Good morning, Butch. Thank you so much for being with us today. And the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gustavo, and hello to all of you today. So as mentioned, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance is the largest collaborative initiative between the UN and the insurance industry. We represent around 200 members around the world, including insurance companies representing about 30% of world premium volume, and 15 trillion in assets. And we also host the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which I'm going to be speaking about specifically right now. So let me share my screen. There you go. Should be. Can you see that, Gustavo, just to be sure?
Yes, yes, I can, but it will be, now it's great. It's in slideshow mode.
Okay,
Thank
very
you
good.
so much. Go ahead. Thank you.
So just to summarize, the way we believe the insurance industry can support sustainability in general, including climate change adaptation mitigation, is through risk management, insurance and investment. Risk management, as mentioned earlier, understanding, preventing and reducing risk to begin with. No one wants losses. So to the point that we can quantify and prevent and reduce those losses, that would be good. Insurance has two roles: a role of a financial shock absorber to absorb shocks when they do happen, but also increasingly to de-risk the transition to a net zero sustainable economy. So there's two parts to it: absorbing shocks and de-risking that transition to net zero, and the wider sustainability agenda. And the third role is the role of institutional investors, which was also touched on earlier. So we need to keep on reminding ourselves that the insurance industry has these three roles to play in sustainable development. Terry already mentioned the big picture, including the science. So what I just want to add there is that we are already at around 1.1 or 1.2 degree of global warming today. So we are looking at 1.5 degrees as the least worst option we could still realistically shoot for. So it will get worse from where we are right now, and the hope is that we can limit it to 1.5 degrees and avert catastrophic climate change. And that's the science behind why we need to go to net zero. Sherry had mentioned TCFD earlier. We have done work on how TCFD can be implemented by insurance companies. This was largely from the context of how climate change would impact insurance portfolios, be it on physical risks, whether it's floods or hurricanes or typhoons, or the transition from a high carbon to a net zero economy. How will that affect insurance business? And even the if there's more climate change litigation in the real economy, what would be the impact of that insurance companies, particularly those who write, for example, directors and officers liability or professional indemnity insurance. Now, that work has been supported by Mark Carney, who's also the chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And that TCFD work is evolving because the latest report is that TCFD goes beyond simply managing climate risk in terms of their impact on your insurance business. It's also aligning financial portfolios, be it lending, investment, or insurance, with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. And that goes into the direction of net zero, where we really need to bring emissions to net zero by 2050 at the latest, if not sooner, so that we have a striking chance of achieving or limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So on the investment side, we know that there's an initiative already, the Asset Owner Alliance, which has already been presented to you in a previous webinar. That alliance was led by insurance company Alianza and has expanded to involve other insurance companies and other institutional investors, such as pension funds. So that's already happening as we speak. It's the oldest net zero initiative in finance. And that's the reason why they're already setting and revealing and publishing their first interim science-based targets for the next 5 years as we speak right now. So what we're trying to do with the Net Zero Insurance Alliance is to cover the insurance or underwriting side or liability side of the balance sheet. And this is the focus of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, and we are trying to match the same ambition of what insurers have done on the asset side of their balance sheet. So this was launched at the G20 Climate Summit in Venice with those global insurers and reinsurers as founding members, and the chair is AXA. This is why it was important to hear from Sherry, not only as the acts as the chair, but also to have insights into what insurance regulators and supervisors and the wider regulatory community, what would be their role in this transition as far as net insurance is concerned. So if you look at the commitments under the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, it's focus on the insurance and reinsurance underwriting portfolios of insurance companies. It requires an insurance company to set science-based intermediate targets every 5 years and to report on those on progress annually. We should have a target setting protocol in place by January 2023, and as soon as that's available, insurance companies that are part of this alliance must publish their first intermediate targets for the next 5 years within 6 months. It also considers latest scientific knowledge because science is evolving and we want to assimilate as much of that into the thinking into the alliance. It recognizes TCFD, but it also looks into the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is an emerging framework right now. And if you look at exactly what happened in Glasgow, one of the big ideas and successes in Glasgow is the fact that nature-based solutions, the role of nature in carbon mitigation, climate change mitigation and adaptation is very strongly linked to the net zero agenda. And then we also are recognizing other frameworks like the Global Biodiversity Framework that will be launched next year. You are required to sign the PSI. Number 8, I think, is very important. We are encouraging any insurance company that joins the alliance to also to do the same on their investment side by joining, for example, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. So this is not a requirement, but we strongly encourage it because we believe an insurance company should be net zero on both its on both sides of the balance sheet. And just like with any initiative, collaboration with the wider industry, regulators, and policymakers is important to make this agenda impactful. So what is net zero insurance? Because this is really the latest concept in net zero finance. A lot of the thinking about finance emissions has largely been around a narrative about investment and lending and not insurance. So here are some of the examples that we have flagged in the commitment of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance to be approaches that an insurance company can take. A company can set underwriting criteria for certain carbon-intensive activities. For example, all the founding members of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance individually have their own coal policy. Some of them have already recently updated their oil and gas policy. So one can do that in insurance. On investment, if insurers can be active owners and engage with companies as that they own or partly own or have a share in, they can also do that in insurance where they can engage with corporate or retail clients that they insure or they might insure on whether they have a credible net zero decarbonization pathway. And just like financing the transition, you can insure the transition and ensure renewables, next generation technologies and breakthrough technologies that's needed to make the net zero transition happen, including nature-based solution. One thing that's very unique to insurance is claims management. So every day there's millions of claims out there, be it property or motor, and how those claims are managed can also, if you are repairing instead of replacing, if you're building back greener, these are efforts that will make help reduce emissions as well. And that's very unique to the insurance business model. Most financial institutions have an enterprise risk management framework or sustainability framework, and we believe that insurance companies can also embed the net zero criteria into these risk frameworks that they use for their business models. And finally, just like any other industry sector, you can engage with policymakers and regulators to make sure that the transition to net zero is science-based as well as socially just as we move to net zero. What are the work streams that we're working on? So the most intense work stream is to make sure that there's metrics for insured emissions. So we know that there are metrics for finance emissions on lending and investment. That exercise of attributing carbon emissions to insurance lines of business or insurance activities has not yet been done. And so we're partnered with the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials to develop the first global standard for insured emissions, to develop baseline metrics for insured emissions. This will then give us insight in terms of how we shape a target setting protocol that will guide insurance companies who are part of the alliance to set their individual science-based targets every 5 years. And that is the exercise that's needed to really help bend the emissions curve. In addition to that, we're working on a white paper that will produce early next year that will show to people who know net zero but don't know insurance what is net zero insurance, or those who know insurance but don't know net zero what is net zero. This is not about adaptation, it's not about investment, it's about mitigation, net zero, and insurance practice. We also have a work stream on engagement. First, largely engaging with policymakers and regulators to raise awareness on what net zero insurance is. And later on, once we have metrics and targets, have a more sophisticated discussion on technical details like insured emissions or metrics that are needed to really bend the emissions curve. A lot of the discussion on net zero insurance is focused on non-life insurance or property and casualty insurance. There's not a lot of thinking yet on how life and health insurers, over and above as their role as institutional investors, on what they can do as insurers of life and health business to help the transition to net zero. So we have a work stream for that. Sherry mentioned that we need to comply with competition law within this alliance. So that is something that we are making sure that we're very prudent about as we implement the alliance, that we are complying with competition law, which is evolving as we speak right now with respect to sustainability issues. Others are communications, etc. One thing I would flag is that we also have flagged the idea that we may need to become fast learners in ensuring next generation and breakthrough technologies and nature-based solutions that are needed to make the net zero transition happen, and accelerate that thinking, and also think about what will happen to legacy industries like fossil fuels, and what would be the risk implications of that to insurance companies, insurance business. And lastly, we're also looking into the idea of what will happen to all the disclosure and reporting on net zero insurance. How will this align with TCFD, with the International Sustainability Standards Board, and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures? This is something that we're thinking of that we can pursue later on. I did mention this partnership already on the insured emission standard that will become available in around September, August, around August next year. Sherry already mentioned some of the new members. We've already gone past Europe and moved to Asia and Africa. We hope to engage companies in Latin America also in the near future. One of the latest organizations that joined is the Lloyd's of London, which is an insurance marketplace, and they have also become part of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Sherry mentioned that we had to pass the UN Race to Zero criteria campaign to be a credible and accountable and transparent alliance. And this is the reason why the UN's high-level climate action champion for COP26, Nigel Topping, has already described the alliance to be the gold standard for commitments by insurance companies on net zero insurance. This goes into the wider GFANS community, which Sherry will describe. So that the basic idea is that every professional financial decision, be it on lending, insurance, and investment, would take net zero into account. And this is also why GFANS was a big step in COP26 in terms of how to galvanize the entire financial system towards net zero going forward. I just wanted to flag that while net zero is absolutely important, this is the other side of the coin, which is adaptation and is resilience is really important as well. We need to address the root cause of climate change, which is emissions, but we know that we will feel the impacts of climate change and things will become worse because we're just hoping to limit it to 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.1 or 1.2 degrees right now. So, and making sure that communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change is really important. Otherwise, these communities will also backslide on their net zero commitments, and we won't achieve a resilient net zero economy if communities around the world are not resilient to the impacts of climate change. And this is the reason why we're working with ministries of finance in developing countries, as well as state level in California, on how can the insurance industry really support climate change resilience in the most vulnerable communities around the world as we transition the economy to net zero. So to summarize, there's so many things that insurers can do. I simply focus on climate change, on TCFD, on net zero, and a little bit on resilience. But we also have produced in the PSI an ESG guide for underwriting. We're trying to look at insurance sustainable development goals into the wider SDG agenda. And as I mentioned, we're also working with sister initiatives like the Asset Owner Alliance on the investment role of insurance companies, and also on work about nature-related risk and opportunities that are part and parcel of the insurance agenda. I leave it there. The next commitment that we have is that beyond insurance companies, we will be targeting brokers. They are part of the alliance. There will not be a separate net zero brokers alliance, just like on investment, where you have a separate asset management initiative. We want them to be part of this initiative. In addition, we also want insurance associations, whether they're national or regional associations, to be part of this alliance and to join the net zero insurance agenda. This is how you can contact us, and I hope you found that presentation helpful.
Thank you very much, Butch. Indeed, very helpful and really provide us with a very good overview of this initiative, what it means. And I have a question that comes from the audience, and it's related to a difficult, I think, subject, which has to do with indicators and metrics that the insurance business would be using to follow and try to keep pace in terms of the insured emissions in their portfolios. And the second part of the question, I'll give it to you right away, is in terms of evaluating social and environmental aspects in connection with the small economies or small type of business, not the so big, large in companies, insurance companies. So the first part is about metrics and indicators that the insurance companies would be applying in their strategy towards the net zero.
Right, metrics, we don't have them yet, and that's what we're doing with the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. We're looking at different methods out there. You know, there's absolute emissions, there's carbon intensity metrics, there's implied temperature rise. There's so many things out there. That exercise has not really been done yet in the context of attribution to insurance lines of business. So we need to have that work sorted. So that working group will come up with a draft early next year that will go to a targeted consultation with the wider insurance industry and then the public consultation. And only then will it become a global standard, because we don't want insurance company ABC to have one set of metrics and insurance company 1, 2, 3 to have a separate set of metrics. We want every insurance company in the world to have the same metrics on net zero insurance so that everyone would be judged on apple-to-apple comparison. But we are exploring the full bandwidth of options right now. However, no one has thought of that until the Net Zero Insurance Alliance came into being. That's why we are fast-tracking that work right now. But rest assured that that will be produced by next year already. And then the metrics is one thing, the targets for insurance companies is another thing. We also need to work on that. And we're already exploring that that work, for example, with Science-Based Targets initiative on what can be done, what is a fit for purpose target setting protocol for the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. So that's the only thing I can tell you is that there's a lot of work underway to get that sorted, but it will come next year. Now, on the second question about the social dimension, I think social for insurance has two aspects. One is the downside risk, and one would be upside opportunities. But for me, if you look at social, we produce until last year, there was no ESG guide for insurance. ESG guidance there has largely been on investment for insurance companies. So if you look at that ESG guide, there's a guidance there about child labor, human rights violations, human trafficking, etc. That's one agenda on the downside risk management. You do not want to have insurance transactions that violate human rights. The upside opportunity is how can you close the protection gap. This is why we believe the insurance industry has a key role to play in a socially just transition, because developing countries in particular are subject to more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So how do we make sure that as we address the net zero agenda, that these vulnerable communities can actually become resilient to the impacts of climate change and be able to have a quality of life that's worth living? Otherwise, it will be all for naught if they will be simply swept away with the slightest typhoon or the immediate or floods there. And this is why small island developing states in particular were very vocal at COP26, and rightly so, because they're front and center as far as impacts of climate change. So there has to be a socially just transition that's part of this net zero transition. And that's why we believe insurers can play a role in that agenda, both in particularly in helping communities become resilient to the impacts of climate change. And that value cannot be simply overshadowed or sideswiped by the net zero agenda. It is absolutely essential. It cannot be the forgotten action, a component of climate action.
Thank you so much, really, and congratulations for all the work you're doing in this path to a more sustainable economy, and particularly on the side of the insurance segment. Thank you so much for being with us today, and good work.
De nada.
Gracias. Bueno, nuestro próximo invitado es Tobias Meyer. Él es Key Account Manager a Swiss Re. Trabaja en una vinculación directa con los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo, en múltiples actividades que tienen que ver con desarrollo y la ejecución de las estrategias de negocios con estas entidades, y por supuesto muy involucrado en lo que es el cambio climático y en negocios que sean mucho más sostenibles. Él está basado en Washington, D.C., no estoy equivocado, y con él vamos a conversar acerca de cómo Swiss Re está trabajando, asegurando el cambio climático y los riesgos ASG en lo que se refiere al negocio de no vida. Tobias, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you to the Inter-American Development Bank for inviting me to this important panel. I'm going to ask Gustavo or your colleagues to pull up my slides while I start talking. You can skip immediately to the second one, slide 2. So what I've been asked to talk about is of those 3 areas which are generally identified where insurers have a key role to play to address these risks, which is 1, through our investments on the asset management side, 2, obviously on the operational side, minimizing our own operational footprint, and 3, on the side of the risks that we take on our balance sheet through our underwriting activities. I'm going to focus on the last one. And I'll try to do so by showing you a couple of charts, essentially, that are produced by Swiss Re, and that some of them relate to Swiss Re, but in a broader sense, really relate to all the companies that are active in this sector, and many of them who are represented on today's panel, on today's webinar. So one of the things you need to, maybe I should clarify, in our sector, we talk about NatCat, and that stands for natural catastrophes. It's a term that you'll hear over and over again. You might hear out of my mouth today. So let's clarify that. It means all the natural risks, including those that are believed to be impacted by climate change in their frequency and severity, but also obviously a peril like earthquake, which really there is no direct relation to the to climate change. So I'll try to make that distinction as we look at these numbers. And my interest really, or my objectives, is to give you a sense of the order of magnitude, if you will, that these risks represent in comparison to others, and also to give you a sense of where we stand in that spectrum of opinions that I observe, and perhaps you've heard of it also, where on the one hand, on the pessimistic side, you sometimes hear the argument that insurers and reinsurers will completely lose appetite for this type of risks as they become more frequent and more severe, and that the market will essentially disappear. And on the other side, there's sometimes this very optimistic, perhaps overly optimistic a viewpoint that we can essentially insure ourselves out of this mess, right? And so you'll find that my reality, or that what I'm going to try to argue for, is that we're very much somewhere in between those, but that there are opportunities and challenges that come with that out there, if you will, in addressing this problem for our sector. So let's just look at the leftmost bubble on this chart. So 4.7 billion is the number of estimated claims that my company, as one of the leaders in the reinsurance field, paid for a particularly devastating year, which was 2017. You may remember that in 2017, there were three huge hurricanes in the Caribbean that also affected, obviously, the southern United States. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. There we go. And it's, I believe, to date still the costliest year in the history in terms of losses paid by the industry as a result of natural catastrophes. Skip to the next slide, and I'll show you a little bit how these claims are evolving. So this is a chart that we'll see another version of in a minute. So let's take a second to look at what this says. On the x-axis, you have the years from 1970 until 2020. And on the y-axis, you have insured natural catastrophe losses in billions at 2020 prices. And the different colors show you the distinction between what we call primary perils and secondary perils. So you should know that in our underwriting activities, insurers and reinsurers very much look at different risks that could affect or trigger a policy or lead to a payout. And so here we make a distinction between primary perils, natural catastrophe perils. Those are traditionally the ones that have huge potential of accumulation. That's hurricanes in this part of the world where I am, also called tropical cyclones or typhoons in other parts of the world, certainly earthquakes. And then also large-scale floods, like we see, particularly, for example, in Europe, that has quite a history of huge floods. And the secondary perils are either smaller events or those, if you will, secondary consequences of primary events. So the most obvious to imagine is excessive rainfall precipitation as a result of a hurricane. And so, as you can see, from 1970 to 2020, there's clearly an upward trend, and the 10-year moving average, which is the red line, indicates how these losses are becoming more and more important in volume. What we also have to recognize, though, is that climate change is not the primary driver behind this evolution. The primary driver in this evolution is simply that there are more and more assets at risk or in locations in harm's way. It's very easy to imagine this if you think back to what Miami or Florida might have looked like in the 1970s and what it looks like today. Then obviously you can imagine that the same storm, if you will, caused a loss of much smaller dollar numbers back then than it would today. So the density of urban populations, the accumulation of values, if you will, of physical assets in locations that are prone to natural catastrophe is the main driver. What you can also see here is that the primary perils that I mentioned earlier, which are illustrated in green here, can lead to huge spikes. And so 2017, there is the largest bar towards the right-hand side of this slide that I referred to earlier. Those are the hurricane that was driven, if you will, by the hurricanes that I mentioned, Harvey, Irma and Maria in this part of the world. And it's the secondary perils in blue and the light blue, if you will, that have a smaller impact, if you will. Now, when they both combine in the year like 2017 or also 2011, then you get the spikes, or 2005, by the way, that was the year of Hurricane Katrina in the United States. And then you can have these outlier years for which we don't really see a trend yet. What we see is a trend related to the secondary perils, so more and more intense rainfall, if you will. Wildfire is another peril that is associated here with this category, and those are difficult for insurers to model. So we tend to be cautious. The insurance industry has a lot of learning to do about how to quantify these perils and how we can become comfortable in underwriting them on a sustainable basis. Now, before you could jump to the conclusion that this might suggest that the insurance industry is about to underwrite itself out of business, we need to skip to the next slide, and there we go. And I'll point out something that is crucial to understand. So my company, yes, Swiss Re is one of the world's leading providers in reinsurance, and there are another couple of companies that fall into that category that are represented on today's webinar. But the reality is that about 75% of risks and 75% of the losses that they cost are simply uninsured today. And so it is not necessarily the case that the claims burden on companies such as mine are increasing and increasing, and we won't be able to pay for them. What is the reality is that more and more of those losses that are being caused by risks that fall into the natural catastrophe category, or that are even directly associated with climate change, are simply going uninsured, and the burden of that is not carried by our industry, but by those who absorb them. If you skip to the next slide, I can illustrate this with the same chart, but what we see here is the difference between insured losses in the dark blue and uninsured losses in the light blue. And each one of these categories from 1970 to 2020 has the 10-year moving average in gray for the uninsured losses, and in I believe it's black for the insured losses. And the widening gap between those two lines is the literal illustration of what Butch rightfully called the protection gap. Right? So you can see that, yes, insured losses are going up over time, but ideally the insurance industry would have charged a premium that is commensurate with that risk and therefore can sustain it. But the uninsured losses are outpacing that development. And so what this means is that if there are uninsured losses, it means that individuals who sustain property damage, businesses that are damaged, that even sustain business interruption as a result of these risks, and certainly also public sector actors, national governments, subnational governments, who implicitly carry this risk when people cannot, who need to come to the assistance of their affected population. They are the ones who carry the burden of this evolution. And frankly, it's you and I as taxpayers, right, who are ultimately affected. And so the reason I point out this trend is that if the insurance industry really wants to make an impact through their underwriting of such risks, then we need to not only focus on our model quality, on being able to assess the insurable risk, but we need to find a way to insure more of these risks. And that involves speaking with actors that are not traditional insurance and reinsurance clients. And this is why I, for example, work for a team that is a global team at Swiss Re that is entirely dedicated to working with the public sector. So institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank that have privileged access and relationships with sovereigns, for example, play a huge role in this, in making people or making decision makers understand what is the burden on them explicitly, if there is a law that requires them to come to the assistance of the affected population, or implicitly, if there's none, but if there's a social or political expectation that they do. To quantify these risks, understand their recurrence period, and understand the different ways that can be, the different means, if you will, that can be put in place to address them. So insurance is one of them, or more generally, risk transfer is one of those instruments that governments are more and more considering. But there are obviously alternatives and complementary ways to do so. So through reserves and emergency funds and contingent credit lines and so forth, that help these countries bounce back quicker, if you will, create that financial resilience that you need in order to respond to these events that are indeed becoming more frequent and severe over time. And so, excuse me, I'll stop there. I hope that this gave you an idea of the dimension, first of all, of the scale of the issue, but also of this distinction between, yes, there are insured losses and yes, they are increasing, but the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry is largely comfortable with those. What makes us really uncomfortable is the reality that if things don't change and if we don't find ways to insure more, if you will, and to allow people, individuals, governments to access and transfer their risks to the market, then we are in danger of becoming less and less significant as these trends increase. With that, Gustavo, I pass it over.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tobias. And indeed, I mean, you raise very important topics. Like number one, it's I mean, so astonishing the share of losses that are not insured. I mean, that's really, and as you say, we are paying in a different way. I mean, through us as taxpayers, as members of the society. And the other thing is that clearly, I mean, what has happened in the past, which was normally used as input for the risk modeling and what is coming in terms of probably is not a good indicator, a good predictor of what might happen in terms of future natural catastrophes, because as we all know, they are increasing in the number of events that we're seeing. Although, thankfully, I mean, in the past year, it was not so heavy. I mean, we already have COVID, but combined, it would be just even more difficult, more complicated. And the other thing is more frequent and more severe in terms of what are you doing? I mean, you know, you're working together with some multilateral banks, but in order to prevent, in order to let's say, increase the or reduce the vulnerability or increase the resilience of in terms of the market. And you mentioned one thing which is very important, which is the relationship with local governance, with policymakers, regulators. But how are you working in, number one, in terms of predicting, how are you adjusting your risk modeling to take care of these natural events, number one, and number two, do you think that it's sufficient what is being done in terms of improving the level of resilience, particularly in our regions, like we are more sensitive to the natural catastrophes?
So in terms of better understanding these risks and being able to quantify them, then by extension, being able to offer more coverage against them, that is a huge area of research for companies like myself. We hire, large teams of very specialized scientists, if you will, to recalibrate these models, to develop the models and adjust them over time. And I personally would make the case that this is such a competitive market, right? That there is no one single players, and there are a multitude of models and views of risk ultimately that compete. And so I see this as a market that is very competitive, thriving, if you will, and that challenges each other. And so it's an ongoing, it's a very live marketplace that I don't think is really threatened by this risk. The larger risk, again, as I tried to illustrate, is really the one where we only take a portion of the losses on our balance sheet to begin with, because people don't have access to insurance at the individual level. Communities, are not experienced with transferring risks. Certainly, sovereign governments, the ones who have done this, and many of them are in the Caribbean and Latin America, do it for the first time, and it's a big step for them. They go through a procurement process. They have to understand, how the market will react. They have to budget for premiums. It requires sign-off. So these are lengthy processes that don't happen overnight. But with each one of these innovative insurance solutions that we see and that we can support, or that the market can support, it's a signal, particularly also when there are payouts and people understand, this works, and this is additional, if you will, tool in my toolbox that I can use. And so the reference that I made to multilateral development banks, and today we're convened by the Inter-American one, is that they are instrumental in making decision makers more comfortable with the alternative that risk transfer provides, right? So transferring risk to insurance, reinsurance, or the capital markets in this way is something that people are unfamiliar with. They have relied tremendously on, some countries have relied, perhaps over-relied on donor assistance in the past, in the aftermath of such catastrophes. They are increasingly, we were witnessing increasing sophistication. Take the government of Jamaica, which took the last step in this journey in this calendar year, actually. They have progressed from having a clear view of the risk that hurricane represents to them in terms of the financial impact that it has, in terms of the frequency with which it must be expected, to putting in place different complementary interest tools, if you will, starting with dedicating a portion of their annual budget to an emergency fund. They have access to contingent loan funding, by the way, from the Inter-American Development Bank. And they have also made the use of the regional sovereign insurance pool that is called the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And then this year, they added a second layer of insurance by transferring a portion of their risk to the capital markets, again, with the support of a multilateral development bank. So this is, I think, the evolution. And I would predict that, as people observe this increasing sophistication, the use of these alternative instruments, they will become more interested in and more willing also to take that step to implement them.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Tobias. I think your messages were eye-opener in the sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about in terms of impact. So thank you very much. And once again, good work and congratulations for what you're doing. Ahora tenemos una pregunta aquí. Bueno, nuestro próximo invitado es Roberto Hernández, director comercial de Commercial Insurance en Zurich, Brasil. Forma parte de los teams ejecutivos también, digamos, a nivel regional, entiendo. Así que con él vamos a estar conversando acerca de un tema realmente muy importante, porque todo esto que hemos estado conversando con los previos expositores en términos de las catástrofes naturales, todos estos cambios que estamos observando en los mercados, presentan muchos desafíos para las compañías de seguro y en términos de cómo enfrentar esos desafíos. Así que quiero darle la bienvenida a Roberto. Roberto está basado en Brasil, pero tenemos el privilegio de que puede hablar con nosotros en español para toda la audiencia. Bienvenido, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y te cedo el lugar para la presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias Gustavo, y buenos días en el continente americano y buenas tardes en Europa, ¿no? Y muchísimas gracias por la invitación de poder compartir tan ilustre panel con mis colegas, ¿no? Y antes de empezar, I would like to congratulate my speaker colleagues for their excellent presentation. Congrats, my friends, really well interesting. Entonces, pasando aquí a hablar en español, ¿no? Hacía tiempo que no conseguía hablar en mi idioma materno, y yo creo que va a facilitar un poco también mi interacción con todos ustedes. Entonces, colocando el contexto, ¿no? De cómo la compañía Zurich entiende la sustentabilidad de nuestro compromiso, ¿no? Nuestro compromiso con la sustentabilidad está muy alto, ¿no? Queremos de verdad crear un futuro mejor todos juntos, ¿no? Y para eso nos hemos marcado como objetivo ser una compañía hiperresponsable con impacto, ¿no? Yo creo que la palabra correcta es impacto, ¿no? Hemos escuchado a mis colegas de otras compañías de seguros, como todos estamos bien focalizados y con una ambición clara de tener impacto en la sociedad, ¿no? Y ese impacto en la sociedad lo que va a conseguir es traer valor, ¿no? Traer valor para nuestros clientes, para nuestros parceros de distribución, nuestros socios de distribución, ya sean corredores, grandes brokers o negocios de parcerías, ¿no? Y poder traer también valor para nuestros empleados que están trabajando en las compañías, para nuestros stakeholders y al final para esas comunidades en las que trabajamos, en las que convivimos y en las que debemos de trasladar algo de lo que de nuestro día a día, ¿no? Para que ellos tengan un futuro mejor, ¿no? Si pasamos a la siguiente diapositiva, nosotros entendemos en la compañía que la sustentabilidad tiene tres temas transformacionales, ¿no? Pasando de la derecha para la izquierda, confianza en la sociedad digital. Estamos en un mundo totalmente digitalizado, cada día más, y nosotros confiamos y tenemos unas iniciativas para que esa sociedad digital sea absolutamente confiante, tratamiento de datos, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Igualmente, nuestras fuerzas de trabajo, nuestros colaboradores, las personas que trabajan para nosotros y que tanto ayudan, ¿no? Sin ellos sería imposible alcanzar ningún objetivo, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a ayudar a nuestras fuerzas de trabajo en esa transición, ¿no? de ese mundo más digital? Y lo que queremos hablar hoy, ¿no? Lo que nos ha traído hoy encima de la mesa, ¿no? Ese desafío del cambio climático, ¿no? Del calentamiento climático, ese desafío que nace en la COP21 del Acuerdo de París con el compromiso de reducir 2 grados el calentamiento global y con por lo menos 1,5, ¿no? 1,5 grados, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a hacer de forma activa analizando los riesgos y cómo vamos a tratar las oportunidades para conseguir ese objetivo que estamos viendo que no va a ser nada fácil y que tenemos que actuar ya en este momento, ¿no? Si me dais la próxima diapositiva, por favor, si nos focamos en qué significa ese calentamiento global y qué tenemos que hacer, ¿no? Hoy en día es una realidad, está impactando a nuestros negocios. Los eventos climáticos de la naturaleza se están incrementando con más frecuencia y siendo más severos. Tobías mencionó algunos datos relevantes de cómo va creciendo el impacto climático y cómo debemos de adaptarnos y mitigar en lo que sea posible ese impacto, ¿no? Cada vez las pérdidas son mayores. Tenemos ahí una tendencia de crecimiento de esas liabilities asociadas a las compañías y a los equipos de dirección de esas compañías por la gestión del cambio climático, ¿no? De su ESG, ¿no? Como Batch también tuvo ocasión de presentar para nosotros. Cada vez más, también Sherry habló, ¿no? Nuestros inversores, nuestros reguladores demandan más de las compañías de seguros, del mercado asegurador para tener un marco mucho mejor de compliance. Los inversores ya no es la antigua figura hoy, todas las compañías de seguros, las entidades financieras como un todo, debemos de ser altamente proactivos en la gestión de compliance y del cambio climático, governance, etcétera, 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 ¿no? Y también cómo vamos a conseguir en esta misión que tenemos el mercado de seguros, que esas pérdidas no aseguradas cada vez sean menor, ¿no? Para eso está el mercado de seguros, ¿no? Para intentar que las pérdidas no aseguradas sean cada vez menor a través de muchas acciones que estamos haciendo cada uno de nosotros, ¿no? Por favor, le damos a la siguiente diapositiva, entrando ya a los desafíos de las compañías de seguro que estamos enfrentando en el cambio climático, ¿no? Súper importante ayudar a los negocios, ya sean pequeños, ya sean medianos, ya sean grandes, o ya sean personas físicas con sus hogares, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a ayudar? ¿Cómo vamos a establecer medidas de mitigación? ¿Cómo vamos a adaptarnos nuestras políticas de suscripción para los riesgos de hoy y los riesgos de mañana, ¿no? Y aquí, súper importante mencionar, ¿no? Los desafíos que tenemos hoy están ligados intrínsecamente al core business de las compañías aseguradoras, al mainstream, la suscripción y la gestión de riesgos, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a ayudar a la transición? Volveré más adelante en esa palabra que es súper importante para la compañía Zurich, la transición. ¿Cómo vamos a entender esas restricciones que el mercado puede ir imponiendo a algunas actividades, ¿no? Esto no funciona cortando los riesgos, ¿no? La suscripción de aquellas compañías que pueden ser más poluentas. Muy al contrario, cómo las compañías de seguros pueden ayudar en esa transición. Volveré, como estoy comentando más adelante, ¿no? La información, el data quality, súper importante. Batch mencionó como uno de los work stream es la padronización de datos, ¿no? Hoy en día tenemos un volumen de datos disociados, destructurados, datos sociales, datos medioambientales. ¿Cómo vamos a utilizar todos esos datos para reflejar correctamente nuestras exposiciones al cambio climático? Los datos, los modelos que tenemos hoy de suscripción puede que no sean los modelos de futuro que tengamos que utilizar, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a adelantarnos, ¿no? ¿Por qué? Porque todo esto va a generar en una alocación de capital, ¿no? Y tenemos que alocar el capital lo más preciso posible para que nuestra política de suscripción sea lo más preciso posible. El coste de reaseguro, cómo es importante tener la información muy padronizada y con una calidad de datos excelente para poder tener un reasegurador como SUSD o cualquier otro, como Tobias mencionó, que nos pueda dar ese apoyo tan importante para el mercado de seguros, ¿no? También es muy importante entender las diferentes estrategias de nuestros clientes. Si son estrategias técnicas, basadas en algunas metodologías más modernas, súper avanzadas, o son tecnologías de estrategias de control de cambio climático basados en hechos naturales, ¿no? Digamos que puede ser reforestación, por ejemplo, ¿no? Colgando un ejemplo, ¿no? O cómo podemos instruir medidas para que las inundaciones sean menos gravosas que están siendo hasta ahora en algunas partes del mundo, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Súper importante para Zurich, ¿no? No estamos en un momento de compensar CO2, es un momento de reducir. Solamente compensando todos los indicadores de tendencia nos hacen ver que no vamos a llegar al objetivo que nos marcamos en París. Tenemos que reducir, no es compensar, es reducir. Ahí es absolutamente urgencia, ¿no? Y comenzando desde cero, desde cosas bien simples, ¿no? Desde nuestras operaciones, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a viajar? ¿Vamos a viajar lo mismo que viajábamos prepandemia? ¿O vamos a estructurar un nuevo modelo de comunicarnos? Seguramente lo segundo, ¿no? No vamos a viajar tanto, vamos a tener un nuevo modelo de relación. Nuestras flotas, ¿no? Que menos que construir o contratar flotas eléctricas a partir de ahora en las renovaciones de las flotas. Y ya no quiero entrar en la reducción de papel, plástico y demás, que todas las compañías del mundo estamos haciendo un esfuerzo muy considerable, ¿no? Aquí quiero hacer mención a lo que Bach mencionó, ¿no? Es súper importante tener una metodología común para nuestro mercado. Igual que el mercado de pricing del carbón, también hay una iniciativa súper relevante para construir de forma global, metodológicamente alineada, unos mercados donde podamos valorar a las compañías, a los mercados en general, del mismo modo, ¿no? Súper importante aquellos workstream del Net Zero Alliance que Bach comentó, ¿no? Y por último, cuánto importante es trabajar de perto con las instituciones, con los gobiernos, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Aquí en Latinoamérica, ¿no? Tenemos un desafío, una urgencia mayor, ¿no? De poder aportar todo ese conocimiento que las compañías aseguradoras tenemos, colocar a disposición de los gobiernos e instituciones públicas y privadas para entender mejor, ¿no? La construcción de nuevas infraestructuras resilientes. Porque una infraestructura puede ser muy sustentable, pero tal vez no es resiliente, ¿no? Tenemos que poner toda esta información en manos de las instituciones públicas y privadas para que esas infraestructuras nuevas que Latinoamérica está desarrollando sean resilientes, que tengan una duración en el tiempo bastante más amplia de lo que hoy estamos valorando, ¿no? Y por último, la siguiente slide, por favor, si me ayudas a colocarlo, es cómo todo esto, en los desafíos, cómo vamos a ayudar a nuestros clientes, ¿no? Y aquí vuelvo a lo que comenté antes, la transición, ¿no? Tenemos que ayudar en esa transferencia de riesgos, tenemos que estar muy cerca de nuestros clientes, entendiendo cuáles son sus desafíos y trabajando con ellos. Trabajando con ellos, aportando nuestra visión de ingenieros de riesgo, nuestra visión de suscripción de tantos años, valorando un montón de datos, etcétera. ¿Cómo vamos a ayudar en esta transición para que en esa transferencia de riesgos el cliente, estos clientes que hoy en día pueden estar volviendo más a la atmósfera, pues puedan tener un futuro un poco mejor y tal vez más rápido, con la ayuda del mercado asegurador, tal vez podamos reducir un poco el plazo hasta llegar a esos objetivos que todas las compañías en esta urgencia absoluta que tenemos, como dijo Ban Ki-moon, ¿no? en París, no hay planeta B, no hay plan B porque no hay planeta B. La urgencia que tenemos todos de acelerar todos nuestros compromisos, ¿no? En este entendimiento, como hablé antes, ¿no? Es todo el ecosistema de cualquier actividad empresarial, desde las personas físicas en su casa, pasando por la pequeña empresa, esa empresa de medio mercado o más mediana, hasta la gran corporación, ¿no? Aquellas grandes corporaciones, todas tienen gerentes de riesgos, jefes de sustentabilidad, etcétera, están muy bien formados, tienen una técnicamente sólidos, ¿no? Pero no tanto aquella pequeña empresa, ¿no? Que está empezando, ¿no? ¿Cómo vamos a ayudarles? ¿Cómo vamos a colocar todo ese conocimiento que el mercado asegurador tiene para ayudar a esa pequeña empresa o esa residencia para que su día a día o su futuro sea más sustentable, ¿no? Y ese compromiso, el compromiso de ser más sustentables junto con ellos, pues vamos a tener un desafío enorme, ¿no? Hoy en día tenemos productos, tenemos servicios que atienden al día a día, pero están apareciendo por ahí nuevas tecnologías donde nosotros, mercado asegurador, vamos a tener que actuar rápido para poder dar respuesta al mercado. Estoy hablando, por ejemplo, hidrógeno, ¿no? que como combustible, energías renovables, ¿no? que con tanto desarrollo en Latinoamérica, por ejemplo, están teniendo en los últimos años y que van a tener, ¿no? Para no depender tanto de otro tipo de energías fósiles, energías más finitas, ¿no? Y aquí tenemos un espacio muy grande, ¿no? Como esos prototipos que van a ser colocados en esas granjas solares o en aquellas plantas de aerogeneradores, vamos a tener que ayudar, ¿no? Es muy, muy importante. O el transporte marítimo, ya se están escuchando noticias de barcos que circulan solos, ¿no? Eso tiene que tener una respuesta del mercado asegurador, ¿no? La aviación con esos combustibles mucho más sostenibles, ¿no? Que están hoy muchas compañías haciendo una inversión muy grande porque son más caros que el combustible tradicional, ¿no? Todo esto nosotros tenemos que estar preparados para aquellas iniciativas de captura, secuestro y almacenaje de carbón, ¿no? Cómo el mercado asegurador va a dar una respuesta a esta iniciativa que va a ser súper importante para el futuro y llegar a esos compromisos de 1,5 grados de París, ¿no? Y por último, soluciones, ¿no? Tenemos que colocar las soluciones encima de la mesa, tener un diálogo abierto, transparente y proactivo con la comunidad de brokers, con la comunidad de asegurados, con las instituciones, con los reguladores, ¿no? Como desde el punto de vista de asegurador o de Zurich, en este caso, vamos a ser un advisor, vamos a colocar de forma transparente todo nuestro conocimiento para que el camino hacia la sustentabilidad sea lo más rápido posible, ¿no? Sin olvidar al final las inversiones, ¿no? Como alguien mencionó, Álvaro, el día de hoy, esa economía circular, ¿no? Como nosotros desde Zurich tenemos un firme compromiso de inversión en los green bonds, ¿no? La compañía a día de hoy creo que tiene invertido más de 5.000 millones de dólares en green bonds, ¿no? En inversiones de impacto sustentable, ¿no? Con todo esto, Gustavo, lo que queríamos mostrar es, tenemos un desafío muy grande, tenemos un camino por delante que caminar todos juntos y el mercado asegurador va a ser un player súper importante para alcanzar los objetivos.
Muchísimas gracias, Roberto. Bueno, te aclaro, yo vengo de un ramo completamente diferente. Mi extracción es de la industria bancaria, por lo cual siempre vi al negocio de seguros como algo complejo, digamos, difícil, muchas veces con un ecosistema de jugadores entre las compañías de seguros, los reaseguradores, los brokers, etcétera. Todo un mundo bastante complejo, donde el tema de alguna forma, de lo que es los datos, digamos, es un tema, imagino, clave y además con mucho valor, porque obviamente contar con esos datos significa tener una cierta ventaja competitiva. Pero aquí viene un poco, por un lado, la pregunta es, en esta situación uno dice, para poder gestionar mejor los riesgos, para poder de alguna manera enfrentarlos y trabajarlo mejor, debería conocer esa situación, digamos, mucho mejor. Y para eso los datos son claves y TCFD en lo que hace a la parte del cambio climático da una buena señal de esa. La pregunta es, ¿qué tan sensible es la información y el tema de poder compartir esa información en la industria del seguro? Digamos, ¿qué tanta voluntad hay de poder compartir para que todos conozcamos mejor cuáles son los riesgos? Hablando como posibles socios en la parte de financiamiento, pero también como inversores, etcétera.
Muchas gracias, Gustavo. Es una pregunta interesantísima y dificilísima de responder. O sea, primeramente, como mencioné, uno de los pilares básicos transformacionales es la confianza en la sociedad digital, y uno de los pilares básicos que Zurich tiene es la protección del dato, ¿no? La protección del dato para nosotros es fundamental. Entonces, por eso digo que no vamos a compartir un dato frío, ¿no? Que no aporte. No, nosotros, yo creo que ahí el mercado no va a estar por la labor. Ahora, datos globales de impactos, como Tobías mencionó y mostró, ¿no? De cuál es el impacto en los eventos catastróficos y demás. Eso es fundamental para entender para entender esos modelos de suscripción, ¿no? Cómo gestionan, cómo se comportan. Necesitamos toda esa información, y hoy el mercado reasegurador, en ese ecosistema que tú dijiste es tan complejo, que son las compañías, el mercado reasegurador sí que tiene esa información, porque al final él maneja mucha información y sí que coloca a disposición de las compañías también algunos datos para poder modelar y precificar correctamente, ¿no? Y ahí, bueno, pues tenemos algunos desafíos interesantes, ¿no? O oportunidades, que es el famoso seguro paramétrico, ¿no? Que está basado en datos. El seguro paramétrico al final no es más que es marcar un evento, y marcado ese evento, la compañía de seguros digamos, indemniza el siniestro, ¿no? No hay un proceso de regulación de siniestro, ¿no? Para marcar ese evento lo que utilizamos son datos que normalmente están soportados por la propia compañía de seguros y por el mercado reasegurador. Hay una conjunción de datos.
Desde el punto de vista de riesgo de suscripción, ¿ves que el tema del cambio climático está teniendo una repercusión, ya sea en el valor a riesgo o en los precios? ¿Cómo están encarando?
Claramente, como hemos mencionado todos los ponentes hoy, cada vez son más frecuentes los eventos de naturaleza y cada vez tienen más severidad. Entonces, esto se valora en la precificación de un riesgo. Se valora porque hoy tenemos más información y tenemos una probabilidad, la que sea, de que un evento catastrófico pueda anticiparse X meses, X años respecto de lo que los modelos anteriores preveían. Entonces sí tiene un impacto, igual al contrario, ¿no? Al contrario, si vemos que tenemos hoy una zona donde históricamente pensábamos que era catastrófica y nuestros datos o los datos del mercado establecen que no es tanto, pues el mercado también precifica de ese modo, ¿no? Yo creo que es súper importante.
Muy bien. Roberto, muchísimas gracias. El tiempo ha volado. Ha sido muy interesante tus comentarios, tus reflexiones sobre los desafíos. Sin duda es un mundo cambiante y para el negocio del seguro, ya McCartney lo había dicho, digamos, es uno de los sectores más sensibles a todo lo que está ocurriendo y entonces creo que es clave poder seguir la evolución de todo esto. Y bueno, y simplemente invitar a todo el sector de seguro para que de alguna forma se una a todas estas iniciativas de los principios de seguro responsable, digamos, sostenibles, y el tema de la iniciativa hacia el cero neto. Creo que el trabajo entre todos es el que nos va a llevar a enfrentar el cambio climático de una manera más efectiva. Muchísimas gracias, muchas gracias a toda la audiencia por haber compartido con nosotros esta situación. No sé si Tobías quiere hacer algún último mensaje, alguna reflexión sobre lo que ha visto y algún mensaje para la audiencia. Tobias, do you have a... Oh, sorry.
I think the diversity of what has been said today underlines a little bit the complexity of the matter, right? And there are multiple angles to address this. The Net Zero Insurance Alliance kind of has that aspiration to address all the multiple ways in which insurance and reinsurance companies can play a role and can make a contribution. My comments obviously focused on the underwriting side, but I guess the diversity of the contributors today at this panel, I think, underlines also the willingness to try avenues and collaborations that in the past were not so common. Who would have thought that reinsurers and insurers would speak on a panel with the United Nations? So here we are. It's not the first one, and it's thanks to to the efforts of people like Butch that we have these new forums and are discussing solutions that in the past were not seriously considered.
Thank you so much, Tobias. Butch, would you like to give us your closing remarks, reflections
Oh, it's very simple. I think we need to make it happen this decade. This is the UN's decade of action. So if we don't cut emissions in half by 2030, we will not reach the 1.5 degree target. And we are basically then condemning this generation and future generations to catastrophic climate change. I wouldn't be able to sleep well at night if that were the case. So I think we all have a reason, a compelling reason to make this the decade of action, both on resilience and net zero. This is not a government agenda only. This is not a private sector agenda only or civil society. It's an agenda for all. So within our spheres of influence, be it the IDB or the UN or a company like Zurich or Swiss Re or AXA, we all have a role to play. So this is really the time to take our ambition to the right level, because we know exactly what to do. And so I think that's the challenge for all of us, is how to live this ambition and this challenge every day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and hope you have enjoyed as much as I did with this webinar, and invite you to our next events. Thank you so much, and have a great day.